Hello, everybody. Peter Maravellis here. I hope this finds you all safe and well. I'd like to welcome you to City Lights Live, the virtual reading series that follows in the footsteps of our in-store calendar during the time of the pandemic. We are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral grounds of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, from where we continue to celebrate the works of authors we know and love with readings, discussions, and forums moving into the fall season and beyond, and hopefully towards a COVID-free era. Tonight, we are celebrating the life and music of the great music legend, B.B. King. With us tonight is Daniel de Visé, the author of his new book, King of the Blues, The Rise and Reign of B.B. King. It is published by our friends at Grove Atlantic Press. Daniel de Visé is an award-winning writer and journalist. He is the author of the critically acclaimed books, Andy and Don and The Comeback, and is the co-author of I Forgot to Remember, a Memoir of Amnesia. He was the co-recipient of a 2001 Pulitzer Prize for his journalism and has worked at the Washington Post and the Miami Herald, amongst other newspapers. He makes his home in Maryland. Joining him tonight in conversation is none other than Harry Duncan. Many of you know him as the host of the KCSM Radio's In the Soul Kitchen, the weekly roots rhythm radio show. And Harry has been a kind of Bay Area-based live music producer and DJ. He's played at many festivals and has toured with many different groups and in concert with people like The Roots and Trombone Shorty, Mavis Staples, Femi Kuti, Neville, and of course, B.B. King, amongst others. He spins a really eclectic and super smart mix of all styles of soul and funk. Yeah, Harry's got this amazing show, and he's also, toured with a lot of groups. You can hear his show every Sunday night from 8 to 10 p.m. On KCSM. It's located at 91.1 FM on your radio dial. His shows are also archived online. So before we begin, I would like to let you know that we'll be posting links in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard with which you may purchase copies of King of Blues. And also be posting links with which you can access Harry's radio show and also his past archived recordings. So please join us now in giving a warm welcome to our guests, Daniel de Visé and Harry Duncan. Gentlemen, welcome to City Lights Live.
So Daniel, first of all, congratulations on having this book become a reality. And I will speak on behalf of all B.B. King fans to thank you for the new facts and the new insights and perspective that your book provides.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you. It was a long time coming. I think one of the reasons it came out as it did and, a little more polished than my previous books is I had this whole pandemic year to kind of, work on it and kind of make it better. I handed it in 2019, but then, what happened and in 2020, we all got idled. And so I spent all these extra months kind of like cutting stuff and adding stuff and making my scenes better and calling back all my best sources. And so, yeah, it actually executed with a little more polish than the last couple of books.
So let me ask you this, since everybody here knows that BB is one of the most recognized and respected and most recorded and definitely most documented artists in the history of blues, or we could say the blues idiom, what inspired you to do all that you've done to put together this, richly detailed, comprehensive bio?
I wanted. I love the man. I love his music. He's one of my kind of all-time favorite musical artists, and I kind of aspired to do this journey back from all of this wonderful guitar sound that I love and I grew up with. We were talking earlier offline about the great, blues guitarists who played in the small clubs in Chicago in the 80s, like Otis Rush and Sun Seals. And then the people whose like music I heard on my record player when I was a teenager, like Clapton and Beck and Page and Peter Green. And just to journey back from that to where those sounds came from. And because I thought I knew, but I wasn't sure that B.B. King was the originator of this sound of a guitar that sounds like a human voice kind of singing. It's this kind of sound. I always thought that came from B.B. King. I thought I knew that. And I wanted to sort of set out to prove it in my book and say, this is the guy who created the sound that became the ubiquitous, pervasive sound of the solo guitar and kind of put the guitar front and center in popular music for the years of my coming up and all the way up really to the end of the century. I don't know when the guitar dropped out of the front rank where it had resided for so many years, maybe around the start of the new millennium. But that was my goal. Just like how, like Louis Armstrong, when I really dug into Louis Armstrong's career and figured out that he was kind of the guy who created this idea of one person stepping forward and taking this solo, this improvisational solo on the trumpet or horn or whatever, that kind of knowledge. That's why this man is so important. I thought I understood it. So that was my goal with B.B. King. I just wanted to make this case, and it took me almost 500 pages because it's a big life. He lived a lot of life. But yeah, that was basically what I was after.
So we had talked about this yesterday, when we met each other. But I think by anybody's standards, B.B. came from a poor, hard scrabble background. So I would like you to speak to what are the core values that he developed from his childhood and teenage years that served him well when he worked so relentlessly, to get the hell out of the Delta, to learn his instrument, to learn how to sing, to learn how to be an on-air disc jockey, to learn how to record, to learn how to tour, etc. I mean, like I think we could lovingly say iron will and determination to succeed.
Yeah, as a biographer, I was always trying to figure out what his kind of core traits were. And, if you're doing a biography, trying to figure out what makes someone tick, that's not going to be a huge number of items. They're like little Post-its you could put on your screen. And for me, B.B. King had a couple of really, really essential traits. One derives from his mother more and one more from his father. The trait that I think he got from his father was his father, whose name was Albert King, not to be confused with the guy who played the Flying V, is that Albert King was an alpha male provider who rose up from impoverishment, from the sort of perpetual debt of sharecropping, and got a job that was at the peak of the sort of agrarian society in Mississippi, which was that he drove a tractor and he earned like $10, $15 a week from doing this. And that remuneration put him at the top of the heap as far as what a black man working in the sharecropping system in Mississippi could have hoped for. And his famous line that he said to B.B. at least once famously was, how can a man work too much? So I think B.B. spent his entire life, his adult life, trying to prove to his father that he could just keep on working and never stop. This is the man who I believe performed 17,000 gigs. And I don't think there's any prominent musical performer who's anywhere close to that number. It was 300 a year until he just couldn't do it anymore. They carried him off the stage from his last gig. And this is all about proving to himself and to his father that he was never going to stop working and that he would work harder than anyone else, basically. The other trait is to do more with family. B.B. lost his little brother when he was about 5 years old. His baby brother died. His mother left his father when he was about 6, and his father went off and started another family. He lost his mother. She died when he was about 10, and he lost his grandmother, who was his caregiver, when he was about 14. And I think he spent his entire adult life basically building a family. And again, this taps into him as the provider. Part of the reason he worked so hard was he wanted to use these millions of dollars to support this big family that he built up. It was 15 children. I believe they were adoptive children. I don't believe that he could father children, but all the more reason why it was very beautiful that he built this big family of these basically adoptive children and provided for them even beyond the grave. To this day, there's a fund that I think sends the grandchildren and great-grandchildren to college. And that was another reason why he built up this huge successful career, was to make this money to sort of provide for his big family that he had.
So in the book, and we talked about this again yesterday, but I think it's something that people might enjoy. You touched on and talked about some of the acoustic Delta bluesmen that, at least, in theory, right, BB may have had the opportunity to see and hear. like Charlie Patton and Son House and Skip James, Robert Johnson, and BB's own cousin, who was Booker White, who gave BB invaluable life and musical lessons once BB, migrated to Memphis and found Booker White. I think he arrived in Memphis not knowing where he was. But what are the roles do you think that some of these folks may have played in BB's music?
Yeah, this is something I wouldn't have understood until I undertook the project. And I don't know if anybody in this room would have understood it either. You have to go way back and put yourself in the place of someone who was growing up in the 30s and 40s. We all know now who Robert Johnson is, right? That double album of his songs, John Hammond handed it to Bob Dylan before Bob Dylan recorded his first album. And since then, we've known who Robert Johnson is. But when Riley King was a teenager, I'm imagining, and he said this, so it's not a big leap. He didn't know Robert Johnson's music at all. I mean, barely, if at all. Wasn't familiar with Son House or Skip James. He would have known some of Charlie Patton's work because if I understand this correctly, Charlie Patton was of the pre-Crash era. So Charlie Patton actually sold a whole bunch of records.
Yeah.
In the late 20s. So where did BB King hear music? He heard it on the radio. He was not going to hear Robert Johnson on the radio in the 1940s. What he was going to hear was big bands with horns and charts and arrangements and suits and ties. This is why BB looked and sounded that way, right? That was the music he grew up with. Big bands with arrangements and suits, dressed up, not a dude with a guitar sitting on a stool. Where else would he have heard music? In his great Aunt Mima's apartment, cabin, she had recordings. She had a Victrola. She had Blind Lemon Jefferson and Charlie Patton, who are probably the only two hard Delta blues. Well, and Blind Lemon was not from the Delta, wasn't even from Mississippi, but the only two players of that ilk he would have really heard when he was young. He heard Bessie Smith, the great blues women. He heard Bob Wills and Ernest Tubb. He serenades a little boy on the farm one day as a teenager. He plays "I'm Walking the Floor Over You." That's a song that he actually heard and knew. So he had Catholic taste with a little C. He wasn't really influenced. In fact, a critic from Britain, from the Blues and Rhythm magazine, very astutely pointed out, why did I spend 3 or 4 pages in my book even talking about Robert Johnson? Because Robert Johnson did not figure in the career of B.B. King. He's right. I do it because he's such an important figure, but not for B.B., not for B.B. King. His influences were, I see this thread of solo guitar, and there weren't a lot of people doing that, playing the solo guitar. It was a weird instrument. It was backbench. You didn't hear it. You didn't see it. I sound like Tommy. You had Lonnie Johnson, not the guy who invented the Super Soaker, but Lonnie Johnson, the brilliant blues and jazz man who was playing solo guitar in the 20s. I think he was inspired by his own work on the violin. I think he played the violin. He was classically trained, and so he just transferred the skill set and was like the first major artist to play a solo on a guitar in the 20s. And then 10 years later, and this is what BB's listening to. 10 years later, Charlie Christian, who is the first really prominent electric guitar solo dude in jazz. The guitar had been amplified by 35, 36. So you get your Charlie Christian playing with Benny Goodman, right? And BB thought he'd seen him on one of those early vid screen things, but I don't think he was ever seen. I checked with a scholar on this. He was only ever, there were recordings of him. There's no video, no film of Charlie Christian. And then in the 40s, you get your T-Bone Walker. And again, I can't stress enough, I don't think there were a lot of big combos led by dudes playing guitar on the rhythm and blues charts in the 1940s and 50s. I mean, I looked at every single #1 hit. You had very occasionally someone like Lonnie Johnson popping up there, but T-Bone Walker was an anomaly. This guy who played electric guitar in front of the band, and he would do the splits and was extremely charismatic. And BB wanted to be that guy. And T-Bone Walker is not playing 12-bar blues. He's not Charlie Patton. He's not from Mississippi. And these are BB's big influences. And so then the leap, and this is what my book is saying, is that the leap is that BB, who's a genius, a musical genius, I think he is one of the great musical geniuses, he takes the solo guitar and he has this kind of leap where he imagines like throwing his voice like Bergen and McCarthy. I'm going to sing, and then when I stop singing, my guitar is going to sing, and that's Lucille, my guitar. And it's almost like you could do a whole Freudian conference on this, but he turns her into Lucille, personifies his guitar. She's going to sing, and that was his leap, is that he's going to play the guitar and it's going to sound like a human voice. And he brought in elements from country western, Hawaiian pedal steel, the slide guitar that he couldn't quite master in the Delta blues, but a softer, more mellifluous, if that's the right word, version of it, where it sounds sweet, like that's the sound. That's his sound, and that becomes his signature sound, I think.
What about Robert Jr. Lockwood? Let's not leave him out.
Oh yes, thank you. Robert Jr. Lockwood is an extremely accomplished, extremely technically proficient, virtuosic, is that the right word, guitarist who'd played on the Biscuit Flower Hour, backing up Sonny Boy Williamson, and could play anything. And he's in Memphis, and for goodness sake, I'm sure he could have played the way that BB plays, but this is BB's sound. BB's the genius who has this, he hears this vision. This is how my guitar is going to sound. He hires Robert Lockwood. BB comes to Memphis and becomes a pretty big star, playing on WDIA, which is the first historically all-black talent radio station. He's very, very ambitious and builds up a following, and so he can earn money, which Robert Lockwood realizes, I could actually earn more money playing for this guy, even though Robert Lockwood is probably technically the better guitarist. We were talking about this the other day, Harry. So yeah. Robert Lockwood ends up backing up BB King. So you have this band in Memphis with two guitarists, which sounds like the 60s in London or the late 60s in San Francisco. A two guitar attack, guitar, maybe a horn, and maybe a bass, maybe a drum. And that front of two guitars allows BB to solo, even though maybe at the beginning he's less technically proficient than Lockwood. And Lockwood plays an extremely accomplished rhythm, basically. And this permits BB to be this guy who doesn't comp, he doesn't do chords, he just plays solos. And he spends his 10,000 hours or whatever. I imagine those happening first before he comes back to Memphis for the second time. And then when he's in Memphis that first year when he's there, because he makes some singles in 49 and they sound pretty rudimentary. He makes some other singles in 1950 for Sam Phillips, and those sound really, really good. And I think he must have spent a lot of time practicing, maybe with Robert Lockwood over that intervening year.
So talking about records, because this is something in particular I'm interested in. On the face of it, right? BB's relationship with the Bahari brothers, who were the owners and producers of Modern and Kent and the Crown record labels, seems, again, on the face of it only, to fit neatly into the well-documented history of exploitation of Black musicians by white label owners. But in the extensive research that you did about the Bahari brothers and their relationship with BB, what did you find in their relationship that made that unique and standalone from that? Well,
you could probably draw a little bit of a line between Modern Records, which isn't so well known, and Chess Records, which of course is very well known. I think in both cases, and this is probably more fair to both sets of brothers, I think in both cases, there were instances probably of royalties not paid. I think it was the habit of the Baharis to give an advance to an artist like BB, which was a flat sum of money, and then he'd never see another dime. There was also chicanery going on in songwriter credits on the singles. Right. If you have a BB King 45, it might say Josiah or Ling. Those are pseudonyms for the Baharis, who took probably unearned songwriter credits, and then they got some of the royalties for that. Now, let's just make clear, BB himself might not have deserved songwriter royalties on some of those songs, because a lot of them were really just covers, uncredited covers. But if anybody in that organization deserved songwriter credit, it would have been BB, not Josiah. So that's the dark side of it. And I think other artists, Duke Records, that guy with the shotgun, what's his name?
Tom Don Roby.
Yeah, if only Preston Lauterbach were here. Don Roby did the same thing. I bet the Chess Guys did the same thing. So there was a lot of shady dealings going on. But I will say, BB, he sued later on and got back some the credits and I think some money. So he got his fair share, at which he richly deserved. And I will say, in the Bahari's sort of favor, that BB always felt that they got out of the way and they let him make beautiful records. I would say the best records he ever made. I mean, if I were to, I made a playlist. I don't know what happened to it, but I made a playlist that shows the journey to The Thrill Is Gone of his significant songs, and all but a couple are from modern records. Those are his great songs, I would say, and they're beautiful. And that's where Maxwell Davis, the amazing arranger, comes in. The Baharis hired him. He was a staff producer, and BB said, that man did my best arrangements, you know, I think in the mid-late 50s. So it's just amazing work that BB did under the Baharis. Maybe my favorite BB King studio LP, and this is going to sound crazy, but it's an eponymous record called BB King, and you'll never find it if you're listening to this. You know, run to Discogs right now. You might get a copy for $20. It doesn't exist. You have to buy it from Ace Records in Britain. It's this record that was, I think, the first record that was released after BB left Modern Records, and it was the best, I'm guessing, of what they had left over. And what they had left over was amazing. It's an amazing record. The VU is turned way too high. It's crackling with distortion, but BB is so passionate on that record. It's like the studio version of Blues is King, if you ask me. It's the eponymous record, BB King. And if you can find it, you should get it.
And then, hold on a sec.
Oh, I wanted to real quickly say, to shout out Glenn Craig, a wonderful photographer. If you look up, guys, if you look up Glenn Craig on Google, I mean, don't do it right now, but do it later. He took amazing historic pictures of BB with Mick and Keith, the Stones. He took wonderful pictures of BB all during the Stones tour in '69. He took beautiful pictures of Tina Turner. He took amazing pictures of Miles Davis. These are all historic photos. Glenn's with us tonight. I think Akko's with us too, and Akko runs a huge Facebook group of BB King fans, so you should join that group. And I don't know if Laura, Lora, is Laura Walker. If that is Laura Walker, she is the daughter of Cato and Polly Walker. Polly Walker managed BB's Memphis affairs for many, 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 many years, and Laura helped her. Laura knows everything. You should be listening to her, not to me. I just wanted to say that. Okay.
And we would be remiss if we didn't mention Blues is King.
Blues is King. What would you say a little bit about it?
Just me personally, having played it many, 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 many times on my radio show, I think it's BB's best live album ever. It was cut in 1966 in Chicago at a small club with I'm trying to think, maybe a sextet.
5 or 6 people.
Yeah, BB, Duke Jethro on B3. What am I missing? And then the trumpet tenor player.
I'm not going to remember. It's all gone out the other end of my brain.
Anyway, the intensity and consistency in that is way different than live at the Regal or BB King live at Cook County Jail or any of the subsequent live albums. I think, this is one of those things where of course it wasn't that kind of situation, but where you feel like he was playing as if his life depended on it. It's that kind of immediacy.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, this is the British version of the book. It's got gold letters. So if you're a completist, they've already ordered a second printing of this. So it must be selling in England. The gold leaf is a British thing. I think that they associate that with Christmas and the poppers and all that. Blues is King. To me, it's almost like a concept record. I don't know if something being a concept record is a good thing or a bad thing, but Blues is King is almost a concept record. It's a breakup album, and there's great like Rumors, is a breakup album, right? This record's a breakup album, and Duke Jethro, the keyboardist aforementioned, told me that they were worried about the man. BB was drinking too much. He was really upset. His second marriage had just broken up to Sue, the love of his life. I believe she was the love of his life, and he was hurting. And the other cool thing about that record is it's not hits really. I think there's only one like single that's even on it. There's a Willie Nelson song.
Yeah,
and
Nightlife.
a lot of deep cuts, and it is a passionate recording. The only flaw that, like, if Dave Marsh were here, would say that I think they recorded bass over it, maybe.
Yeah, they overdubbed Louis Satterfield on a couple of tunes. And
If
really,
Grail-
he's not a bass isn't his principal instrument.
If,
But
if,
anyway.
if Grail Marcus were on this call, he might point this out. But other than that, it's a splendid recording. And so if you want to start a collection, you could do a lot worse than buying those 3 live albums that are just a few years apart. The Regal, Blues is King, and then the Cook County Jail. They're all wonderful, but I think, Harry, you and I agree that maybe Blues is King might be the best of the 3. And the musicians felt that way. They did. They told me that.
So leaping ahead a little bit, because I want to make sure we have time for the Q&A. Why was BB's first and subsequent Fillmore shows so pivotal and so important?
Well, so BB was in a segregated world, not just the world in which he lived, but the music world. I wasn't alive at this time, but I guess that in the 50s, throughout the 50s and into the 60s, there were black clubs and there were white clubs, and they wouldn't let the one into the other. I mean, if you managed, like David Ritz, I think, who collaborated with BB on his memoir, snuck into a black club and saw him once. But that's what it took. I mean, it's insane, but you couldn't see BB almost at all if you were white, because he played in these segregated black clubs, and the white world didn't know about him, basically. It's crazy, but I guess that's how it was. And bit by bit over the into the 60s, things start to open up. The Regal album, which is of course recorded in a black club, Chicago, beautiful palace of a club. I was on WVON a couple days ago, the wonderful radio station, whose DJ Purvis Spann introduces BB that night at the Regal. Anyway, so that comes out, and I picture that falling into the hands of a bunch of white fans and guitarists over the next year or two. BB's stuff had started trickling over into Britain. His single of Rock Me Baby is a big hit in Britain. And then these British guitarists come back over to the States, white British blues rock guitarists, and introduce this sound to all these bands and fans, along with this, wonderful procession of younger black electric blues artists like Otis Rush, Albert King, Sun Seals, Albert Collins, Buddy Guy. They were all, I picture them all entering the scene around the beginning of the 60s, and gradually over that decade, they start introducing the sound. And so by the sort of late 60s, by 66, 67, suddenly this beautiful human voice style of solo guitar is kind of just exploding in American pop music. And it's BB's sound. I'm certain of this. I mean, he'd been doing it for almost 2 decades by this point. And Fillmore is not the very first, but the first major significant gig that he ever does for basically any audience other than the black audiences he'd been playing for. And so he plays for, I'm guessing, a mostly white audience. Carlos Santana is in the audience, and I'm sure there are black and Hispanic and Asian American people in the audience, but it's mostly white hippies. And it's February of 67, and it changed his life, because after that night, he ends up going on Ralph Gleason's show. Ralph Gleason being the great columnist who writes about him, starts writing about BB. He starts making records that are more crossover records that sound more like rock and sound more like soul and sound more like funk, with Bill Szymczyk, who later kind of discovers the Eagles, and they collaborate, he and BB, with these wonderful musicians. It's an integrated band. Jerry Jamot, the great bass player, who does the do 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 do, thrill is gone, that bass part, beautiful. And he goes on Carson, and he goes on Ed Sullivan, and he goes on tour with the Stones, and his life changes, because suddenly he is a international star, and no longer playing just in segregated clubs, basically. You know, the world is now his oyster.
So we all know that BB has, profoundly, deeply influenced several generations of guitar players. If you think of, Eric Clapton and Mike Bloomfield and Carlos, Elvin Bishop, Robert Cray, Stevie Ray Vaughan, and so forth, they're the high-profile disciples. But then there's what is it in BB's guitar playing that continues to inspire, lesser known and up and coming guitarists, literally all over the world?
Well, I'm not sure what the place of the guitar is now in music. And I am living in the past. I was very, very, very knowledgeable up until about the end of the 90s. I was reviewing shows and reviewing records, and I was really on top of things all through that decade. And around the end of the century, I mean, I still listen to a lot of music and I'm trying to discover new stuff, but I'm not exactly sure what's going on in popular music now. I will tell you that I think I had this friend, Ian Bruce Douglas, who founded a band called Ultimate Spinach in the part of the Boston sound in the late 60s. And he and I shared a lot of beers. And he told me how, 67, 68, these guitarists all came over from Britain and they all had these thick picks and they all played with this wonderful sustain and they all played like B.B. King, right? And by the end of the 60s, almost every self-respecting band in either country, blues, rock, whatever, black or white, had to have a guitarist who played like B.B. King, basically, who played this style, this beautiful lyrical style. And this sound, anytime you hear somebody playing the solo guitar that sounds like a crying human voice, you're hearing B.B. King. And I mean, there's a lot of horrible lead guitar that takes place in the 80s and 90s. But when these people slow down and listen to their soul and stretch out their sounds a little bit, they're playing B.B. King. And I mean, it's never gone away. I think that, you have BB to thank for the fact that like every cover of any blues magazine for the last 30 years has pretty much featured a man or woman holding a guitar. I mean, it wasn't that way. This sort of electric blues guitar was not at the center of anything when BB King hit the scene in 1949. I mean, he largely put it there. And there are these other threads. There's the Chuck Berry thread, which is kind of rhythm as lead. Chuck Berry's thing was basically he didn't have horns, so he would do the horn parts on his guitar. That becomes Keith Richards' thing. It's a whole thread of guitar. There's the slide, Bonnie Raitt, Duane Allman, Elmore James, goes back to Elmore James, Muddy Water. There's that thread. But I think the mainstream of solo guitar for that whole era until the end of the century pretty much was the B.B. King sound. And that's his influence. I mean, that's a massive influence, I think he is so much bigger than the blues. And if you read all the obituaries that were written when he died, I mean, they're beautiful obituaries, but not one of them said this about him. Not one obituary that I could find said, this is the guy who created the pervasive guitar sound that puts the guitar front and center in popular music for the last 30 years. I think it's such a big accomplishment, and it seems impossible that one guy could have kind of been behind it. But I think that's what genius is. And also, I mean, he's a huge figure. Louis Armstrong deserves that big credit, and I think BB does too.
Peter, is it time to do questions and answers?
A few Q's and a few A's.
Yeah, I mean, they're starting to trickle in. Audrey asks, is the chairman of the BB King estate pursuing any legal action against you or the publisher regarding the sterility claims? Does he have any DNA evidence proving that any of the kids are biologically related to BB King?
Let me walk that back a bit. In 1980, the great Charlie Sawyer, who's a polymath, he's a great photographer. I think Glenn Craig and I would agree on that. Charlie Sawyer took great pictures and a great writer. He wrote the authorized bio of BB King. And in that bio, Charlie Sawyer stated, with BB's authorization, with his approval, that BB had gone to a fertility doctor in the late 50s and found out he couldn't have kids. Now, that doesn't conclusively prove that he couldn't have kids in the several years before that or the several years after. But we know also that BB was married twice, and those two marriages spanned 16 years, and neither of those marriages produced any children. And both of those women had one or more children with other spouses. So that's Exhibit B. Exhibit C is I interviewed BB's doctor, and BB told his doctor that he'd had a venereal disease when he was a young man, around the time he was in the service, and that it was his belief that was the reason why he could not have children. So that's what I think I know. And everyone in BB King's inner circle, every last one of them, told me that they were as near as certain that BB King's children were essentially adoptive. I don't think they were legally adopted, but essentially adoptive. Now, why does any of this matter to me? Because I'm his biographer, at least this is my take on his life. And as his biographer, I think it's hugely important that he wanted desperately to have this big, bustling family, okay? That was enormously important to him. It's poignant, he worked so hard to build this family. And at a certain point, he kind of cut it off and said, okay, 15 is enough, no more. But he had this big, big family and was always in touch with them, always giving them, helping them financially. So I think that I read on, TMZ, that the estate took exception to some of my characterizations, some of the characterizations that I just made right here in this forum. That's certainly their right. All the more reason to buy the book for yourself or for someone you love who loves BB King and went and saw him 10 times. Buy the book, read the book, and you'll hear the whole story. That's about all I know about that. But what's interesting to me, in the end, I don't really care about proving whether or not they were his biological children. The thing that's fascinating is that he wanted so badly to have those children, right? That's the interesting thing.
So we have, actually, it turns out Laura is the Laura you were thinking.
Laura.
Daniel, good evening. It's Laura. Please give me Mr. Luther Henson, or please give Mr. Luther Henson some credit for influencing BB King, who often said he taught him to be a man. And then she also comments, BB King asked the children, quote unquote, if any of them wanted DNA tests, and they all declined.
So Laura Walker, Ms. Laura Walker, who knows way more than me, just said this, that at one point, BB said, guys, if you really want to figure things out, we could all take DNA tests. And that kind of silenced the room. Make of that what you will. Ms. Laura wants me to make a very good point, which is that BB King, Riley King, as he was known when he was a kid, had a couple huge, huge father figures. Remember I said he'd lost his family, basically. So these father figures were hugely important. One was the great Luther Henson, who taught the one-room segregated school in Kilmichael, which is a little town south of the hill country in north central eastern Mississippi, and in whose one-room schoolhouse Riley King studied for a number of years. I was able to interview one or two of his classmates who were still, well, at least one who was still alive. I found her in a nursing home in Winona. Jessie Mae Hemphill, I think her name was. And Luther Henson taught the students to take care of themselves, their bodies, their souls, their spirits, taught them good habits, taught them ethics, taught them to treat each other, women and men, with respect, taught them about great Black men and women in African-American society. These were people they would not have learned of probably in the white-owned newspapers. The white newspapers mostly wrote about Black people when they were accused of crimes. Not always. There was an Indianola paper that did cover the Black community to some extent, at least by the 40s. But by and large, these children were not going to hear about great Black Americans in the white-owned press. I'm not trying to, make a screed here. That's just how it was. Luther Henson taught them about these people. He would bring in the African-American newspapers and show them to the children and say, look, this is, and then the number one thing BB took away from Luther Henson was education. It's the one thing that you can get that the white people can't take away from you. The other great parental father figure from that era is Archie Fair, the Reverend Archie Fair. I picture Riley hopscotching among 2 or 3 different churches in his childhood, but one church was the Church of Archie Fair, who was a guitar slinging preacher who sang and played guitar, I'm guessing maybe with a battery powered amp, because there was no electricity in Kilmichael. And BB worshiped the man, wanted to be him, wanted to learn the guitar after meeting the Reverend Archie Fair and watching the effect he and his guitar had on the flock. In fact, for a long time, until his late teens, BB wanted to be a gospel singer and sing in a gospel. He had a gospel group that went on the air in Greenwood, Mississippi, the famous St. John's, something like that. They wanted to be the soul stirrers, basically, until this is the story that he was out on the street corner and he would play gospel songs and they loved it. But if he played blues songs, they'd put money in his hat. So the die was cast. He was going to be a blues man after that. Thank you, Ms. Laura.
So Diane comments, she teaches a lecture titled "What Blues Musicians Can Teach Physicians" to med students to improve communications in medical encounters. She asks, what should I include for my students about B.B. King's communication style that would make us better doctors?
Oh my God. I'm kind of flummoxed. B.B. King, I would argue, was one of the all-time great showmen, or showwomen. I mean, show people. I saw him at the Blues Festival in Chicago in 1987, which was one of his biggest shows that he ever did, maybe his biggest audience that he ever had in the States. And I was a mile away from him, but I felt like I was right in front of him. I interviewed many people who met him, spent time with him backstage. God, he had this way of making you feel, as soon as you walked into the room, like he cared about only you. It's like a politician's sort of polish. And it wasn't an act. I mean, he really did have this radiant warmth, and you'd walk in and he'd make you feel like $1 million. I mean, we should all be this way to our fellow human beings. He was very good about breaking up conflict. There's a scene in my book where they're in a little town, and a reporter from the New York Times is there. This is in '68, and some racists in this cafe pick a fight with BB's musicians. And basically, and then these racist cops show up and are going to make more trouble. And BB walks up, and with his gravitas and his charm and his charisma, he just basically talks everyone down and breaks it up. And that's what he could do. He was like, I think, like a master politician, but sweeter, and I think more genuine. And I interviewed so many people for this book. I mean, there's like 60. I feel like there's 50 pages of notes at the back of this, and I didn't find a one. I bet Laura would say she never met anybody who didn't think this was a wonderful human being, just a sweet, wonderful, loving guy, and so intelligent. I mean, he's a genius, this musical genius, but he's not like a mean, cantankerous genius. He's a warm, loving, sweet genius, which is the best kind of genius.
So we have a comment from Jack. How would you characterize BB's relationship with Sid Seidenberg, and do you think Sid ever took advantage of BB?
Oh, that's a great question. Real interesting, and Laura's going to correct me if I'm wrong, but BB had a relationship with Sid. Sid Seidenberg came into his life around 1968, and I'm not going to say that one was in charge of the other. They collaborated. They were like, BB said, they felt like brothers, like they'd known each other their whole lives. They were a similar age. They'd both served in the same military camp for some bizarre reason down in Mississippi. And they just bonded instantly. Sid was a Jewish guy from New York. BB was BB, but they just hit it off instantly. And one thing that David Ritz, BB's collaborator on his memoir, told me, oh, hi, Emma. Emma's my old friend, my dear old friend from Chicago. Anyway, one thing that I've lost my train of thought. They really, really loved each other. And just Sid collaborated with BB to basically take his genius and his enormous talent and raise him up to this higher level. Remember, he'd already been at the Fillmore. He was starting to break through, but Sid, as his manager, sort of helped navigate him onto this talk show circuit, national television, radio, a much better deal with his record label. BB was very, very modest about his accomplishments always. And Sid was not. Sid would like, you've got an A-list artist on your roster, you a-holes, you better start treating him like one. BB wasn't going to do that, but Sid was. And he helps BB, they collaborate. They end up with BB going to Africa with the State Department. 5 years after that, he goes to Russia with the State Department. He becomes like a Louis Armstrong figure, an ambassador for American culture. massively wonderful collaboration that made both of them very rich. But having said that, it's maybe not a collaboration that might have happened 30 years on, because, you know, much later in his life, I think BB started to realize that, you know, the deals he had with Sid, I think Sid was part, like maybe 25% or 50% owner of a lot of BB's businesses. They were like brothers, and he loved the man. But after Sid was gone, he departed the company around 2000. This is telling that I think Floyd Lieberman, who replaced Sid, basically had, Floyd told me he had basically the same deal, the same split, but BB did not love Floyd Lieberman like a brother. And so he basically rejected him in the end, and, you know, and they parted ways, and not amicably. So it's hard to judge that relationship. I think kind of like the relationship with the Baharis, I doubt the terms were as good as they might have been for BB, but there's no question that this collaboration between these two men paid massive dividends. So I don't know, what can you say? I think BB was very, very happy with what Sid had done for him in the end. I mean, that I'm sure.
So Walter King sends his regards.
Walter King.
The person who was writing this says, he called me and instantly recognized your voice. I will send a link to him of this recording. It says, this is Stafford.
Okay. Stafford Davis was a long, is that you? Hey man, long time member of Mr. King's entourage, and an absolutely treasured source. I interviewed him over and over again. I mean, these people are the book. That it's not really my book, it's really their book. And Walter King is BB's nephew. And if you need any proof of BB's genetic genius, you need look no farther than Walter. Multi-instrumentalist, no less than Miles Davis. Walter told me this the other night, that he compared him favorably to Sonny Rollins. Beautiful performer. And I had the great pleasure of meeting him for a second time and going out to dinner with Walter in Nashville, and we had a blast. BB's nephew, and played in his band for a long time. Was the leader for a number of years, and the one, I think, blood relative of BB's who actually played in his band, I think, unless I'm missing somebody. So this is all-star cast here tonight.
So we are just about out of time. Harry, do you have any last thoughts, or did you have any questions before we wrap it up?
I think it speaks volumes that Charles Sawyer, I'm looking at one of the poll quotes, Daniel, says that you write beautifully. His command of narrative is compelling. The level of detail he amassed is awesome. And that's what I got out of this. I mean, when I first started reading it, I said, Jesus, God in heaven, how am I ever going to make it out of BB King's childhood? Man, I want to go to Memphis. I want to be there at the recording of Blues is King, you know. But it's extraordinary. I mean, I can only imagine the quality of time and energy and effort you put into this. And, you know, I applaud and respect you for that.
Well, Harry, again, this is the British version. You know, I've reviewed a bunch of books actually over the last year or two for the Washington Independent Review of Books. And one thing I find is the prologue is usually really amazing in most books. And my prologue is the Cook County Jail. So the trick is to keep the energy going after the prologue. And I did my best. I tried to keep the energy going and to present scene after scene after cinematic scene. And that was what I did during the pandemic. I was pestering Stafford all the time, and pestering Laura, and pestering Glenn Craig. But in between my phone calls to those people, and what they did, what Stafford did and what Laura did, was they helped me flesh out these scenes and make them better. And I had a whole year, 2020, to basically bulk up my scenes and make them even better and more three-dimensional, and to triangulate. And I would ask them, like, okay, so Stafford, you know, what did you see out the window in that hotel room, you know, or what color was the bedspread, that kind of thing. Just any kind of detail to make it more cinematic. And
right.
To the extent the book succeeds, it's thanks to them and their memories and the time that I had to make. I tried to do like a whole bunch of different scenes that were as good as that prologue at the Cook County Jail, basically.
Well, gentlemen, that is all we have time for. Thank you so very much, Daniel de Visé. Thank you, Harry, for doing the honors. Really appreciate it. And thanks to all of you in the audience for joining us. You helped complete the circle. Please be safe, be well. We hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Peter. Thank you, everyone.